Listen here, children of the scattered seed. Come close to this fire that burns without wood, this flame that feeds on memory alone. Don't you go turning your face away now, 'cause what I'm fixin' to tell ain't meant for the tender-hearted, but it's meant for the rememberin' souls. This here story don't ask for your comfort, and it asks for your witness. In them days of deep sorrow, when the morning sun rose red as blood over the cotton fields of Georgia, there walked among us a woman they called Scarlett. But Lord have mercy, that wasn't her true name. No, sir. Her real name, the one her mama whispered in her ear while the ship rocked and the chains sang their iron songs, that name got swallowed by the same dark waters that took so many of our people. The Atlantic Ocean, it holds more African names than any graveyard ever will. Now I tell you this because you need to understand. Scarlett was a woman of iron wrapped in flesh that remembered. She carried herself like somebody who knew something the white folks didn't know, something that made her back straight even when the overseer's whip was cracking the air behind her. Folks in the quarters used to say she had the sight, that she could see the spirits of the ancestors walking among the cotton rows at twilight, their feet barely touching the red clay that drank so much of our suffering. This here plantation where Scarlett came to know her trials sat deep in the heart of Georgia, where the land was fertile and cruel, where the soil was red as the blood it had tasted. Master Whitfield owned near 200 souls, and he ran that place like he thought God himself had appointed him to break the spirit out of every one of us. The man believed in what he called proper discipline, which was just his fancy way of saying he took pleasure in watching black folks suffer. But it wasn't just the whip and post that made that place a corner of hell on earth. No, sir, it was that oil house, that cursed building where they rendered the fat from slaughtered hogs and cattle, where the fires burned day and night, where the air was thick enough to choke a man just from breathing it. The smell of that rendered fat, it clung to everything, your clothes, your skin, your soul. Even now, when I close these old eyes, I can smell it still. Scarlett, she worked them fields like the rest of us, her hands knowing the cotton bolls better than they knew rest. But there was something different about the way she moved through that world of bondage. She had what the old folks called a keepin' spirit, the kind of soul that holds on to what matters even when everything else gets stripped away. When the work songs rose up from the fields, her voice was always there, strong and true, carrying the melody that our ancestors brought across the water. The conjure woman, old Aunt Minda, she used to watch Scarlett with eyes that saw more than most. That child got the blood of resistance running through her veins, she'd whisper to them that would listen. The spirits done marked her for something bigger than this place, bigger than these chains. And Aunt Minda, she knew about such things. Her grandmother had been a root doctor back in the motherland before the slave ships came calling. It was in the hush harbors, them secret places deep in the woods where we gathered to pray our real prayers, that Scarlett first started showing her true nature. While the preacher man appointed by Master Whitfield told us from his pulpit that we should be grateful for our bondage, that suffering was God's plan for the African race, Scarlett would lead us in the old songs, the ones that carried messages and memories the white folks couldn't understand. Wade in the water, she'd sing, her voice rising above the cypress trees like smoke from a sacred fire. God's gonna trouble the water. And we all knew she wasn't just singing about baptism. No, sir. She was singing about freedom, about the Underground Railroad, about the River Jordan that would carry us away from this land of bondage. But the spirits that spoke to Scarlett, they were preparing her for something darker than escape, something that would test every fiber of strength the ancestors had woven into her soul. The trials that were coming would make Job's sufferings look like a gentle summer rain. And Scarlett, she sensed it too, in the way the wind changed direction when she walked past the oil house, in the way the very air seemed to whisper warnings that only she could hear. Now, before I tell you how Scarlett came to know her greatest trials, let me take you back to where it all began, to them days when she was still young enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, there might be mercy somewhere in this world. She wasn't born on Master Whitfield's plantation, oh no. Scarlett came to Georgia in chains, just a child of maybe 10 or 11 summers, holding tight to her mama's hand as they stood on that auction block in Charleston, South Carolina. I can see it still, clear as yesterday's pain. That auction block made of rough-hewn pine, stained dark with the tears and sweat of thousands of our people who had stood there before. The auctioneer, A fat man with tobacco juice stained in his beard. He called out numbers like he was selling cattle, which I suppose to his mind he was. "Here's a fine breeding wench," he'd shout, his voice carrying over the crowd of white men who gathered to buy human flesh. Strong back, good teeth, already got one pickaninny to prove she can produce. That pickaninny he spoke of so casual-like, that was Scarlett. And the breeding wench was her mama, Kesey, though the white folks never bothered to learn that name, never cared that it meant born during hard times in the language of their ancestors. Kesey had made that terrible journey from the Gold Coast when she was barely 16, her belly already swollen with the child that would become Scarlett. She had survived the Middle Passage, survived the seasoning period in Barbados, survived the sail that brought her to the rice plantations of the South Carolina Lowcountry. On that auction block, mother and child stood together for the last time, their hands clasped so tight that their fingers went white around the knuckles. Kesey whispered prayers in the old language, words that Scarlett didn't understand but felt deep in her bones, words that would echo in her dreams for years to come. The mama spoke of Yamoja, the mother of waters, who watches over children and remembers every tear shed by mothers separated from their young. She spoke of Oya, the spirit of the wind and the guardian of the cemetery, who carries messages between the living and the dead. "Remember who you are," Kesey whispered in English, her voice barely audible above the noise of the crowd. "Remember that you are more than what they call you. Remember that your ancestors are always with you even when you can't see them. Remember that love is stronger than chains, stronger than the whip, stronger than death itself." Then came the moment that split Scarlett's world in two. The moment when Master Whitfield's overseer pointed at the girl and said, "I'll take that one." But when he pointed at Kesey, a rice planter from down near Beaufort spoke up louder, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "That wench is mine," he declared. And the auctioneer's gavel came down with a sound like thunder. They pulled mother and child apart with the same casual cruelty they might use to separate calves from cows. Kesey screamed, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth, a sound that carried the anguish of every mother who had ever lost a child to slavery's appetite. Scarlett tried to run to her, but strong hands held her back, white hands that gripped her arms so tight they left marks that lasted for weeks. The last thing Scarlett ever saw of her mama was Kesey's face in the back of a wagon, tears streaming down her cheeks but her eyes still fierce, still full of love and defiance. She was mouthing something, and though Scarlett couldn't hear the words over her own crying, she knew her mama was still praying, still calling on the ancestors to watch over her baby girl. The journey to Master Whitfield's plantation took 3 days. 3 days of walking in chains behind a wagon loaded with farming equipment and other newly purchased slaves. Scarlett didn't speak a word the whole time, not even when the overseer threatened her with the whip for her silence. She just walked, one foot in front of the other, her mind replaying every word her mama had whispered to her, every prayer and promise and piece of love that had been crammed into those final moments. It was old Moses, a field hand who had been working Master Whitfield's land for near 20 years, who finally reached Scarlett when they arrived at the plantation. He was a man bent by labor, but not broken by it. His hair white as cotton, but his spirit still burning bright. "Child," he said, his voice gentle as rain on parched earth, "you gonna make it through this. Your mama's prayers are gonna carry you, and the ancestors gonna guide your steps." Moses became like a father to Scarlett in them early days, teaching her the rhythms of plantation life, showing her how to pick cotton fast enough to avoid the overseer's attention, but not so fast that they'd raise the quota for everyone. He taught her which roots and herbs could heal a fever, which songs carried coded messages about escape routes, which white folks might show a moment of mercy, and which ones would kill you just for looking at them wrong. But most important, Moses taught her how to keep her mama's memory alive, how to honor the ancestors even in the midst of bondage. "Every prayer you pray, child, your mama hears it," he told her. "Every tear you shed, she feels it. Every time you stand up straight when they try to break you down, she smiles. Death ain't the end of love, Scarlett. Love goes on." The years passed like seasons of suffering, each one bringing its own particular flavor of hardship, its own lessons in how much a human soul can endure before it either breaks or transforms into something harder than iron. Scarlett grew from a grieving child into a woman who carried herself like she was born free, even though she never knew a day without chains. She learned to read the moods of Master Whitfield and his overseer, Silas Crow, learned to disappear when their tempers turned dark and their eyes started hunting for someone to hurt. Master Whitfield was a man who believed that God had made two kinds of people, those born to rule and those born to serve, and he took his role as ruler with the seriousness of a zealot. He read his Bible every morning on the big house porch, sipping coffee served by silent house slaves, and he found in them holy pages every justification he needed for the cruelties he visited upon us. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters," he would quote at the plantation chapel on Sundays, his voice booming across the wooden pews where we sat, required to listen to his twisted version of God's word. For in doing so, you serve the Lord Christ. But it wasn't Master Whitfield who made life a daily hell for most of us. It was his overseer, Silas Crow, a man who seemed to have been born without the part of the soul that feels mercy. Crow was tall and lean, with pale eyes that never seemed to blink and hands that were always fingering the whip he carried at his side. He had come to Georgia from somewhere up in the Tennessee mountains, bringing with him a reputation for breaking the most rebellious slaves, for turning proud Africans into shuffling, head-down field hands who jumped at shadows. Crow understood that the real power of slavery wasn't in the chains you could see. It was in the chains you couldn't see, the ones that wrapped around a person's spirit and squeezed until they forgot they had ever been anything but property. He used fear like a master craftsman uses his finest tool, applying it with precision and terrible skill. A whipping here, a sold family member there, a night spent chained to the whipping post without food or water. These were the brushstrokes with which he painted his portrait of absolute control. It was Crow who decided that the plantation's oil house would serve a purpose beyond just rendering fat and making soap. In his mind, that building with its constantly burning fires and its air thick with the smell of melting flesh became a perfect theater for the kind of punishment that would teach lessons that lasted. "Ain't enough to hurt 'em," he would tell Master Whitfield over dinner, his voice calm as a preacher's. "Got to hurt 'em in a way they'll never forget, in a way that'll make the others think twice before they get any ideas about resistance." The oil house sat at the edge of the plantation, a low building made of rough pine boards with a tin roof that threw back the heat like a mirror throws back light. Inside, great iron cauldrons hung over fires that never went out, fed by a steady supply of pine logs and oak stumps. The air in that place was thick enough to chew, heavy with smoke and steam and the constant smell of rendering fat. Even the strongest men would start to sweat and gasp after just a few minutes inside, and the heat would make your head spin until you couldn't tell which way was up. It was in that oil house that Scarlett first saw Crow's particular brand of cruelty in action. She had been working the plantation for near 5 years when they brought in a new arrival, a young man named Kofi, who had been sold down from Virginia for the crime of learning to read. Kofi made the mistake of letting Crow catch him scratching letters in the dirt during the dinner break, and the overseer's eyes lit up like he had just discovered a vein of gold. "Seems we got ourselves a scholar," Crow announced to the assembled field hands, his voice dripping with mock respect. "Well, if this boy loves letters so much, maybe we should give him a proper education." They dragged Kofi to the oil house and forced him to kneel beside one of the smaller cauldrons, where the fat was just beginning to bubble and pop. Crow took a long iron ladle and dipped it into the boiling oil, then held it over Kofi's upturned palm. "Now, scholar, let's see if you can spell obedience." The scream that came from Kofi's throat was like nothing Scarlett had ever heard, a sound that seemed to tear itself free from the very center of his being. The oil hissed and steamed where it touched his flesh, and the smell of burning skin mixed with the already heavy air, until some of the watching slaves turned away and retched. But Crow wasn't finished. "That was just the first letter," he said, his voice never changing, never showing even a flicker of emotion. "Now let's work on the B for broken." It was watching Kofi's torture that something shifted inside Scarlett, something that had been building since the day they tore her from her mama's arms. She felt a cold rage settle into her bones, a fury so deep and pure that it felt almost like peace. But with that rage came a terrible understanding, that this was how Crow saw all of them, as raw material for his lessons in power, as bodies to be broken for the instruction of others. That night in the quarters, old Aunt Minda came to Scarlett where she sat staring into the small fire that heated their cabin. The conjure woman's eyes were sad, but knowing, like she had seen this moment coming from far off. "Child," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the flames. "I can see the spirits gathering around you, and they ain't the kind that come to bring peace. You best be careful, 'cause once you start down the path they're showing you, there ain't no turning back." But Scarlett had already seen too much, had already felt too much, had already lost too much to worry about turning back. The ancestors were calling, and she was beginning to understand what they wanted from her. "Now listen close, children, 'cause what I'm fixin' to tell you ain't written in no book, ain't taught in no school. This here knowledge got passed down through blood and tears, through whispers in the dark and songs sung low while the white folks slept. This is the wisdom of survival, the unwritten rules that kept our people alive when death was easier than living." Scarlett learned these rules the way a bird learns to fly, not from teaching but from necessity, from watching what happened to them that forgot or never knew. She learned that in slavery, you gotta be two people at once. The one the white folks see and the one that stays hidden deep inside where no whip can reach, no chain can hold. The first rule was simple but hard to follow. Keep your eyes down but your spirit up. Old Moses taught her this while they worked side by side in the cotton fields, their hands moving steady through the white bowls, while their voices stayed low. "Look at your feet when Crow's around," he whispered, "but never forget to look up at the stars when he ain't. Them stars, they the same ones that shined on your mama in Africa, the same ones that guided Harriet and them others to freedom." Scarlett learned to read white faces like storm clouds, knowing when Master Whitfield's mood was turning dark by the way he held his coffee cup, knowing when Crow was looking for trouble by the way his hand rested on his whip handle. She learned that Tuesday mornings were dangerous, 'cause that's when the master read his mail and sometimes got news that put him in a foul temper. She learned that Saturday nights were worst of all, 'cause that's when Crow would drink his corn liquor and go prowling through the quarters looking for any excuse to use his fists. But the hardest rule to learn was this: how to help your people without getting them all killed. 'Cause in slavery, mercy was a luxury that could cost more than cruelty. When young Bess got caught stealing scraps from the kitchen to feed her sick baby, Scarlett wanted to stand up and take the blame. But old Aunt Minda grabbed her arm with fingers strong as iron and whispered fierce in her ear, "Child, if you speak now, they'll whip you both and sell that baby before dawn. Sometimes love means holding your tongue." So Scarlett learned to love sideways, to help in ways that couldn't be traced back to kindness. She learned to drop her own portion of cornbread where the hungry children could find it, making it look like accident. She learned to sing the old songs that carried healing in their words, spirituals that would settle on the sick like gentle hands. She learned to pray with her eyes open, sending strength to them that needed it without the white folks ever knowing that magic was happening right under their noses. The conjure work that came natural to Scarlett like breathing comes natural to the living. Aunt Minda saw it in her from early on, saw the way spirits would gather around the girl when she wasn't even calling them. "You got the sight, child," the old woman told her one night when they were alone by the fire. "But more than that, you got the touch. The ancestors are working through your hands." Aunt Minda taught Scarlett which roots would ease a woman's birthing pains, which herbs would break a fever, which combinations of graveyard dirt and red pepper would turn back curses sent by enemies. But she also taught her the deeper mysteries, the ones that reached back to the motherland and forward to the day when all chains would be broken. She taught her how to read the messages in bird flight, how to know when the dead were trying to speak, how to feel the pull of the crossroads when spirits were gathering for important work. "Remember this, child," Aunt Minda would say while they worked by candlelight, their hands busy with roots and herbs and small bones. "They can chain our bodies, but they can't chain our souls. They can take our names, but they can't take our knowing. They can steal our children and sell our men, but they can't stop the ancestors from walking among us, can't stop the old ways from living on." Scarlett learned to carry her power quiet-like, never letting it show in her face or her walk. She learned to heal without being seen as healer, to protect without being known as protector. When the field hands would wake up to find small bags of roots and herbs tied to their cabin doors, bags that would keep sickness away and bring good fortune. They knew where they came from, but nobody ever spoke it out loud. When curses sent by house slaves jealous of field privileges would turn back on themselves, everybody understood that somebody was working for justice, but nobody said the name. But the most important rule Scarlett learned was this: never let them see you planning. 'Cause planning meant hoping, and hoping meant you still believed in tomorrow, and a slave who believed in tomorrow was a dangerous slave indeed. So she learned to carry her plans like she carried her prayers, silent, steady, and strong as the oak trees that had been growing in Georgia soil since before the first white man ever set foot on American ground. The white folks thought they had broken Scarlett's spirit with work and worry, with the constant threat of separation and sale. They thought she was just another field hand, head down and hands busy, dreaming of nothing bigger than her next meal and her next night's sleep. They had no idea that behind those downcast eyes, a woman was learning, growing, preparing for the day when preparation would turn into action, when survival would transform into something else entirely, something that would shake that plantation to its very foundations. Let me tell you about Master Jonathan Whitfield, a man who looked at his reflection in the morning mirror and saw the face of God looking back at him. He was born to wealth in Charleston, raised on stories about how his grandfather had tamed the Georgia wilderness with nothing but grit and righteousness, how his daddy had turned red clay into cotton gold through proper understanding of the natural order. Master Whitfield believed with his whole heart that some folks were born to command and others were born to obey. And he saw his role as master not as accident of birth but as divine appointment. Every morning before the sun had even thought about rising, Master Whitfield would sit on his wide porch with his coffee and his Bible, reading passages that confirmed what he already knew about the world. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, he would read aloud, his voice carrying across the silent yard where house slaves were already stirring the kitchen fires. Not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. He would nod his head and take a long sip of coffee, satisfied that Scripture and slavery were partners in the Lord's great plan. The big house where Master Whitfield lived with his pale, sickly wife and their 3 spoiled children was a monument to the wealth that slave labor had built. 2 stories of white-painted wood with tall columns and wide verandas, filled with furniture shipped from Charleston and carpets that had crossed the ocean from England. Crystal chandeliers caught the light and threw it around rooms where no black hand was allowed to touch anything except to clean it. Mrs. Whitfield spent her days lying on silk-covered sofas, complaining about the heat and calling for house slaves to bring her cool drinks and fan her fevered brow. But it wasn't the luxury that made Master Whitfield dangerous. It was his absolute certainty that he was right about everything. He had read books about the African mind, books written by men who had never set foot on African soil, but who were certain they understood the Negro character. These books told him that black folks were like children, unable to care for themselves, naturally lazy, and requiring firm guidance to be productive. Master Whitfield believed every word, and more than that, he believed it was his Christian duty to provide that firm guidance no matter how harsh it needed to be. Kindness, he would tell visitors who came to admire his plantation, is the greatest cruelty you can show a Negro. They mistake kindness for weakness, and weakness leads them to rebellion and sin. Firm discipline, applied consistently and without sentiment, is the only way to maintain proper order. He spoke these words with the confidence of a preacher delivering a sermon, never doubting that his listeners would nod and agree with his wisdom. Master Whitfield's idea of proper discipline went beyond the whipping post, though he certainly believed in the power of the lash. He believed in what he called instructive punishment, pain that taught lessons not just to the individual being punished, but to everyone watching. When a slave was caught stealing food, it wasn't enough to whip them and dock their rations. Master Whitfield would have them locked in the smokehouse for 3 days without food or water, so they could think about the difference between honest hunger and sinful greed. When field hands worked too slow, Master Whitfield didn't just threaten them with the overseer's whip. He would sell one of their children to a plantation so far away that they would never see the child again, making sure that everyone understood that the consequences of laziness extended far beyond personal pain. The Negro mind, he would explain to his wife over their evening meal, responds only to consequences that touch what they value most. Take away their children and they learn to value their work. But Master Whitfield's cruelest innovation was his partnership with Silas Crow, a man who shared his master's beliefs, but took them to places even Master Whitfield hadn't imagined. Crow had come with excellent references from plantations in Tennessee and Alabama, places where slave rebellions had been crushed so completely that the very idea of resistance had been burned out of the survivors. He brought with him techniques and methods that made ordinary punishment look like gentle correction. The key, Crow would tell Master Whitfield during their evening discussions on the porch, is to make them understand that resistance is not just futile but impossible. You got to break something deeper than their will. You got to break their imagination. They got to stop being able to picture themselves as anything but slaves. And Master Whitfield would nod and pour another glass of bourbon, pleased to have found an overseer who truly understood the philosophical foundations of proper slave management. It was Crow who suggested that the oil house could serve purposes beyond rendering fat and making soap. Heat, he explained, is something every animal understands, and pain that comes from heat, that goes deeper than pain that comes from a whip, leaves different kinds of scars, the kind that change how a person thinks about their own body, their own skin. Master Whitfield listened with the attention of a student learning from a master, nodding as Crow explained the psychological benefits of what he called thermal correction. Together, Master and Overseer developed a system of escalating punishments that moved from public whipping to private torture, from physical pain to spiritual breaking. They believed they were perfecting the science of human control, finding more efficient ways to transform African warriors into American property. They studied their slaves the way other men studied crop rotation or livestock breeding, always looking for ways to increase productivity through better management of the human resource. What neither Master Whitfield nor Silas Crow understood was that every act of cruelty was being watched, remembered, and stored away in hearts that beat with ancient rhythms they could never hear. They thought they were breaking spirits, but they were actually forging them, turning soft metal into steel through the application of heat and pressure. They thought they were teaching lessons about power, but they were actually teaching lessons about justice, about the difference between strength and brutality, about the day when accounts would finally be settled. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with an act of protection that looked like an act of defiance to eyes that couldn't see the difference. It was late summer when the cotton was ready for picking, when every hand on the plantation worked from can see to can't see, when even the smallest children spent their days dragging cotton sacks through rows that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The heat was fierce that year, the kind that made the air shimmer and dance, the kind that killed old folks and turned strong men into stumbling ghosts. Young Celia had come to Master Whitfield's plantation just 2 months before, sold down from a tobacco farm in Virginia, when her previous master died, and his debts came calling. She was maybe 16 years old, with skin the color of honey, and eyes that still held some of the brightness that slavery hadn't yet managed to dim. But Celia had one problem that made her a target for Crow's particular attention. She had never learned to move invisible, never learned to fade into the background when danger was near. Celia worked in the big house alongside the other house slaves, serving meals and cleaning rooms and trying to stay out of the way of Mrs. Whitfield's nervous temperament. But she had grown up on a smaller plantation, where the master's wife had been kind, where house slaves were treated more like servants than property, where a girl could speak when spoken to, and sometimes even smile without fear. Celia didn't understand yet that kindness was a luxury that Master Whitfield's household couldn't afford, that survival depended on becoming invisible. It was a Tuesday morning in late August when everything went wrong. Totzings, Whitfield had been suffering from one of her spells, lying in her darkened bedroom with wet cloths on her forehead, calling weakly for cool water and complaining about the heat that made breathing itself feel like labor. Celia was bringing up a pitcher of fresh water from the well when she encountered Master Whitfield coming down the main staircase, his face already dark with the kind of mood that made smart slaves disappear until the storm passed. "Where is that water?" Mrs. Whitfield's voice drifted down the hallway, thin and demanding. "I've been waiting an eternity for simple cool water." Master Whitfield's jaw tightened, and he turned his pale eyes toward Celia with the kind of look that should have sent her running. But Celia, still learning the rules of this new place, made the mistake of trying to explain. "Sir, I was just bringing it up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The well is running a bit slow today, but I got fresh water here." She held up the pitcher, her hands trembling slightly, and that trembling seemed to anger Master Whitfield even more. He didn't like to see fear in his slaves, not the obvious kind that showed they still thought they had something to lose. "Are you making excuses to me, girl?" Master Whitfield's voice was quiet, which was always more dangerous than when he shouted. "Are you telling me that my well on my plantation is not adequate to serve my wife's needs?" He stepped closer to Celia, and the girl took a step back, which was another mistake. In Master Whitfield's world, slaves didn't retreat from their betters. They stood still and took whatever was coming. What happened next took maybe 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds would change the course of many lives. Master Whitfield reached for the pitcher. Whether to take it from Celia or to knock it from her hands, nobody would ever know. Celia, frightened and confused, pulled back slightly, and the pitcher slipped from her wet hands. It hit the polished wooden floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire house, sending water and broken pottery sliding across the hallway. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before lightning strikes, heavy and electric and full of terrible possibility. Master Whitfield stared down at the mess, his face turning red, then white, then red again. Mrs. Whitfield's voice came from the bedroom, sharp with annoyance. "Jonathan, what on earth is happening out there?" "Clumsy wench," Master Whitfield said, his voice still quiet but now carrying the edge of true fury. "Stupid, worthless creature." He looked at Celia, who had dropped to her knees and was frantically trying to gather the pieces of broken pottery, her hands shaking so hard she could barely grasp the fragments. "Silas," he called, his voice carrying down the stairs like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Silas, I need you up here." That's when Scarlett appeared, like spirits sometimes appear when they're needed most. She had been working in the kitchen garden just outside the back door when she heard the crash, and something in the quality of the silence that followed told her that disaster was unfolding upstairs. She came through the kitchen and up the back stairs, moving quiet as smoke, arriving just as Crow's heavy boots started climbing the main staircase. Scarlett took in the scene with eyes that had learned to read trouble like storm signs. The broken pottery, the spilled water, Celia on her knees crying, and Master Whitfield standing over it all like an avenging angel. She understood immediately what was about to happen, understood that Celia was about to be introduced to the kind of punishment that would either break her completely or kill her outright. "Master Whitfield, sir," Scarlett said, her voice carrying just the right mixture of respect and urgency. "I believe that pitcher was cracked already. I noticed it this morning when I was helping in the kitchen. Should have spoken up then, but I didn't want to trouble nobody. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that might save a young girl's life. The kind of lie that the ancestors would forgive." Master Whitfield turned his pale eyes toward Scarlett, and she could see him calculating, trying to decide whether to believe her story or not. Crow had reached the top of the stairs now, his hand already resting on his whip handle, his eyes taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of a man who made his living from other people's pain. "Is that so?" Master Whitfield asked, his voice dangerously soft. "And I suppose you think that makes this acceptable? That carelessness with cracked pottery is somehow better than simple clumsiness?" "No, sir," Scarlett replied, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm just saying the fault might be more mine than hers for not speaking up when I should have." She could feel Celia's grateful eyes on her, could sense the girl's relief and terror warring with each other. But she could also feel something else gathering in the air around them, something dark and inevitable as winter coming on. Master Whitfield looked from Scarlett to Celia and back again, and when he smiled, it was the smile of a man who had just realized he could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. "Lord have mercy on my soul for what I'm about to tell you, but some truths got to be spoken even when they burn the tongue that speaks them. What happened that day in the oil house wasn't just punishment, it was ritual. A ceremony designed to teach every black soul on that plantation that resistance would be met with suffering so terrible it would live in the memory long after the flesh had healed." Master Whitfield's smile told Scarlett everything she needed to know about what was coming. It wasn't the quick, angry smile of a man who had lost his temper. It was the slow, satisfied smile of a man who had found exactly the opportunity he'd been waiting for. "Well, Scarlett," he said, his voice carrying the false gentleness that always preceded his worst cruelties. "If you're so eager to accept responsibility, then perhaps you should experience the full weight of that responsibility." Crow's pale eyes lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. This was his element, his art, his calling. "Should I gather the others to watch, Master Whitfield?" he asked, his hand already moving toward the coiled whip at his belt. "Make sure the lesson takes proper hold?" "Oh yes," Master Whitfield replied, his gaze never leaving Scarlett's face. "I want everyone to see what happens when carelessness meets accountability. Send word through the quarters. Attendance is required." He paused, savoring the moment like fine wine. "And Silas, prepare the oil house. I think our Scarlett would benefit from some thermal instruction." The words hit Scarlett like cold water, but she kept her face still as stone. She had seen what the oil house did to Kofi, had watched strong men come out of that building changed forever, their spirits broken along with their flesh. But she also knew that running would only make it worse, that pleading would only feed their hunger for her degradation. The ancestors were whispering to her now, voices carrying across the years from ships and auction blocks, from cotton fields and grave dirt. "Stand tall, daughter. Show them what we are made of." Within the hour, the whole plantation had gathered around the oil house like mourners at a funeral, except the mourning was for the living. Field hands stood with their heads down and their hearts heavy, knowing they were about to witness something that would haunt their dreams. House slaves clustered together, grateful it wasn't one of them, but terrified it might be next time. Even the children were there, wide-eyed and silent, learning early what defiance cost in Master Whitfield's world. Inside the oil house, the fires burned hot and steady, feeding the great iron cauldrons that bubbled and hissed like living things. The air was thick enough to choke on, heavy with smoke and steam and the smell of rendered fat. Crow had already prepared a smaller cauldron, one that could be lifted and carried, its contents heated to just the right temperature, hot enough to sear flesh, but not so hot as to kill outright. Death would have been mercy, and mercy was not part of this lesson. They stripped Scarlett to her shift and bound her hands behind her back with rope that cut into her wrists. Master Whitfield stood to one side, his Bible open in his hands, ready to quote scripture about obedience and submission, while his overseer applied the practical theology of pain. "The rod and reproof give wisdom," he read aloud, his voice carrying over the gathered slaves. "But a child left to himself brings shame to his mother." Scarlett closed her eyes and let her spirit travel back to her mama's arms, back to the auction block where Kesey had whispered prayers and promises. She could hear her mama's voice now, clear as if she were standing right there. "Remember who you are, child. Remember that you are more than what they do to you. Remember that love is stronger than chains." The first touch of the oil was like being struck by lightning, a pain so pure and complete that it seemed to exist outside of time. Her body jerked against the ropes, every muscle contracting at once, but no sound came from her throat. She had decided in that moment before the oil touched her skin that she would not give them her voice. They could have her flesh, but they could not have her cry. The oil ran down her back like liquid fire, and she felt her skin blister and split, felt the heat penetrate deep into muscle and bone. But somewhere beyond the pain, beyond the smell of burning flesh and the gasps of horror from the watching slaves, she found a place of perfect stillness. It was a place where her ancestors gathered, where her mama sat singing the old songs, where spirits danced around fires that burned without consuming. "You see?" Master Whitfield called out to the assembled slaves, his voice cutting through the crackling of the oil house fires. "This is what happens when pride overrides prudence. This is what happens when a slave forgets her place." But even as he spoke, he could see that something was wrong. Scarlett's silence was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of someone who had found strength in places he didn't know existed. Crow poured again and again, each application of oil leaving new patterns of destruction on Scarlett's back. But with each pouring, her silence grew more powerful, more complete. The watching slaves could feel it too. This wasn't breaking. This was transformation. This was a woman finding out what she was truly made of, discovering reserves of strength that ran deeper than pain, older than slavery. When it was finished, when Crow finally set down the empty cauldron and Master Whitfield closed his Bible, they carried Scarlett back to the quarters like a broken doll. But the slaves who tended her wounds knew better. They could see it in her eyes, could feel it in the way she breathed. She had not been broken. She had been refined, like metal in fire, like gold in the crucible. Old Aunt Minda worked through the night, applying poultices of roots and herbs, singing healing songs that reached back to Africa and forward to freedom. "Child," she whispered as she worked, her ancient hands gentle as rain. "You done something today that's gonna echo through generations. You showed them the difference between a body and a soul, showed them that pain can teach strength as well as fear." But even as the conjure woman worked her healing magic, she knew this was just the beginning. Master Whitfield's smile had been too satisfied, too complete. He had tasted something in that oil house, something that fed a hunger she recognized from her grandmother's warnings about spirits that feed on suffering. This would not be the end of Scarlett's trials. It would be the first verse of a song that would play until one of them was silenced forever. The days that followed the first bath moved like honey poured in winter, thick and slow and heavy with unspoken dread. Scarlett's back was a map of destruction, the oil burns healing into raised scars that would mark her flesh until the day she died. But it was the silence that truly worried the other slaves, not the absence of screams during the punishment, but the presence of something else, something that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Scarlett moved through her work like a woman walking in her sleep, her body performing the familiar motions of cotton picking and corn hoeing, while her spirit traveled paths that led far from Georgia red clay. She spoke when spoken to, ate when food was put before her, slept when darkness fell. But those who knew her best could see that she was only partly present, that some essential part of her had retreated to places where overseers' whips could not reach. Old Moses watched her with eyes that had seen too much, had witnessed too many good people broken by the machinery of bondage. But what he saw in Scarlett was different from the hollow-eyed resignation he recognized in slaves who had been crushed beyond repair. There was something gathering in her, something that reminded him of storm clouds building on the horizon, heavy with electricity and promise. "She's walking between worlds now," Aunt Minda told him one evening as they sat by the small fire in their cabin, their voices low enough to avoid the ears of the house slaves who sometimes carried tales to the big house. "The ancestors done called her to a path that ain't meant for the living, but she's still got flesh and blood holding her to this world. Makes her dangerous, to them and to herself." It was 3 weeks after the first oil bath when Master Whitfield decided that the lesson needed reinforcement. Scarlett had been working the cotton with the same steady rhythm she had always maintained, her scarred hands moving through the bowls with practiced efficiency. But something in her posture, something in the way she held her head, suggested to Master Whitfield that her spirit had not been sufficiently humbled. "Silas," he called to his overseer as they stood watching the field hands work under the brutal August sun, "I believe our Scarlett may need another reminder of her proper place in God's order." His voice carried the casual tone of a man discussing the weather, but Crow heard the hunger underneath, recognized the particular appetite that had been awakened in his master. "Yes, sir," Crow replied, his own pale eyes fixing on Scarlett's bent form. "I was thinking the same thing myself. Sometimes it takes more than one lesson to drive the point home proper like." He fingered his whip handle, but both men knew that ordinary punishment would not serve their purposes now. They had discovered something more satisfying than simple pain, something that fed deeper hungers. When they came for her the second time, Scarlett felt the approach like animals feel earthquakes coming, a trembling in the earth that spoke of disruption and change. She finished picking the cotton bowl in her hands, added it to her sack, and straightened her back slowly, like a woman preparing for a long journey. Around her, the other field hands continued working, but their movements had taken on the jerky, desperate quality of people trying to disappear into their labor. "Come along, Scarlett," Master Whitfield said, when Crow had escorted her to where he stood. Time for another theological discussion. His smile was the same as before, satisfied and cruel. But now there was something else in it. A recognition that this had become about more than discipline, more than maintaining order. This had become about proving something to himself, about demonstrating that his will was absolute in all things. The oil house had become a shrine to suffering, its cauldrons kept constantly hot now, the fires never allowed to die down. Master Whitfield had given Crow permission to modify the building, to add restraining devices and other implements that would make the lessons more educational. The overseer had thrown himself into the work with the enthusiasm of an artist, finally given unlimited supplies. This time they did not call the other slaves to witness. This time, the ritual was private, intimate. A conversation between torturer and victim that required no audience beyond the spirits that gathered to watch. Scarlett was bound to an iron frame that Crow had installed near the largest cauldron, her arms spread wide and her feet barely touching the floor. Master Whitfield opened his Bible to a passage he had been contemplating since the first oil bath, words that seemed to speak directly to their situation. "And if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off," he read aloud, his voice echoing in the smoky air. "It is better for you to enter life crippled than with 2 hands to go to hell." He looked up at Scarlett, hanging in her bonds like a dark angel awaiting judgment. "Sometimes, salvation requires suffering, Scarlett. Sometimes, we must burn away the parts that lead us astray." But when the oil touched her flesh this second time, something different happened. Instead of retreating into the still place she had found before, Scarlett felt herself expanding, felt her consciousness spread out beyond the boundaries of her tortured body. She could see the oil house from above, could see herself hanging in the frame while Master Whitfield and Crow conducted their twisted ceremony. But she could also see further, could see the quarters where her people waited and worried, could see the big house where Mrs. Whitfield lay complaining about the heat, could see all the way to the crossroads where spirits gathered to witness human suffering. Her mama was there at the crossroads, standing tall and proud as she had never been allowed to stand in life. Kesey reached out her hand, and Scarlett felt herself being pulled toward that place where pain had no meaning, where masters held no power, where freedom was not a dream but a present reality. "Not yet, daughter," Kesey said, her voice carrying the authority of the ancestors. "Your work here ain't finished. They think they're breaking you, but they're actually making you into something they can't comprehend. Let them pour their oil. Let them think they're winning. Every drop they spill is building something they'll never understand until it's too late." So Scarlett let her body hang in its bonds while her spirit walked with the dead. Let the oil burn her flesh while her soul gathered strength from sources that predated slavery, predated America, predated the ships that had carried her people across the bitter water. She understood now that this was not about punishment. It was about preparation. The ancestors were forging her into a weapon that would strike when the time was right, in ways that Master Whitfield and Crow could never anticipate. When they finally released her and carried her back to the quarters, Aunt Minda saw immediately that something fundamental had changed. The woman they brought back was not the same woman who had been taken away. This Scarlett carried herself like someone who had died and been reborn, like someone who had seen beyond the veil and returned with terrible knowledge. "How many more times?" Aunt Minda asked as she worked her healing magic, as she applied poultices and sang prayers that reached back to the motherland. Scarlett looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold centuries, with a gaze that spoke of journeys taken in spirit while the flesh remained chained. "As many times as it takes," she replied, her voice carrying new harmonics, new depths. "They think they're teaching me about submission, but they're actually teaching me about power. Every time they hurt me, they're showing me exactly how much pain one human being can inflict on another. And when my time comes, I'm going to return that education with interest. Listen close now, children, because I'm fixing to tell you about numbers that got carved into memory deeper than any branding iron ever cut into flesh. 12 times they took Scarlett to that oil house. 12 times they thought they were breaking down what could not be broken. But numbers got power beyond what most folks understand. And 12 is a sacred count, a completion, a full circle that brings things back to where they started, but changed. The third time came just 2 weeks after the second. Master Whitfield's appetite for these theological sessions growing stronger with each feeding. He had taken to reading different passages from his Bible before each session, as if he were searching for the perfect scriptural justification for what he was doing. Whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. He read that third time, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had convinced himself that cruelty was kindness. But the slaves listening from outside the oil house knew better. They could hear the hunger in his voice, the way it shook slightly when he spoke of purification through pain. The fourth and fifth times blurred together in a haze of smoke and steam, the oil house becoming a temple to a god that fed on suffering. Crow had added new refinements to his equipment, pulleys and chains that allowed him to position his victims with greater precision, to apply the burning oil with what he called surgical accuracy. But what neither master nor overseer understood was that each session was teaching Scarlett lessons they never intended, showing her depths of human cruelty that would inform her own actions when the time for action came. By the sixth oil bath, Scarlett had learned to separate herself so completely from her physical form that she could watch her own torture as if it were happening to someone else. She would float above the scene, watching Master Whitfield's face as he quoted scripture, watching Crow's pale eyes glitter with satisfaction, watching her own body jerk and twist against restraints that held her fast. From that elevated perspective, she could see patterns they couldn't see, could understand that their cruelty was following rhythms older than their conscious minds. "They're feeding something," she told Aunt Minda after the seventh bath, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had seen too far into the darkness. "Every time they hurt me, something gets stronger in them, something that ain't quite human anymore. They think they're in control, but they're just servants to hungers they don't understand." The conjure woman nodded, her ancient hands working with roots and herbs that carried memories of healing back to the motherland. "Evil got its own appetites," she replied, her voice heavy with knowledge passed down through generations of root doctors and wise women. "And once you start feeding it, it gets harder and harder to stop. They done opened a door they don't know how to close, child, but that door swings both ways." The 8th, 9th, and 10th oil baths came with increasing frequency, Master Whitfield's need for these sessions consuming more and more of his time and attention. Mrs. Whitfield complained that her husband was neglecting his duties to the plantation, that the cotton wasn't being supervised properly, that the house slaves were growing lazy without proper oversight. But Master Whitfield had discovered a source of satisfaction that made all other concerns seem trivial, a way of exercising power that fed something deeper than mere authority. It was during the 11th oil bath that Scarlett finally understood what the ancestors had been preparing her for, finally saw the full scope of the lesson she was being taught. As the oil ran down her back like liquid fire, as Master Whitfield quoted passages about purification and redemption, she realized that she was being shown exactly how much pain one human being could inflict on another. Not so she would learn to accept it, but so she would learn to apply it. "They think they're breaking me," she whispered to herself as her spirit walked among the gathered ancestors, as her mama and grandmother and great-grandmother all nodded their approval at what they saw. "But they're actually giving me a doctorate in cruelty, teaching me things I never wanted to know about the human capacity for causing suffering. And when my time comes, when the moment is right, I'm going to use every lesson they've taught me." The 12th oil bath came on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the air was finally cool enough to make the heat of the oil house feel like stepping into hell itself. Master Whitfield had grown so accustomed to these sessions that he no longer bothered with lengthy biblical quotations, no longer felt the need to justify what he was doing to anyone, including himself. The ritual had become pure appetite, pure feeding, pure exercise of power for its own sake. But as Crow prepared the cauldron and Master Whitfield opened his Bible to a random passage, something different happened. The oil, which had always been heated to precisely the right temperature, was somehow hotter than usual. The ropes, which had always held fast no matter how violently Scarlett's body responded to the torture, seemed somehow looser. The iron frame, which had been solidly anchored to the oil house floor, creaked and shifted in ways it had never moved before. Scarlett felt the change too, felt the ancestors gathering around her in greater numbers than ever before, felt their voices rising in a harmony that seemed to make the very air vibrate with power. 12 is completion, daughter. Her mama's voice came clear as church bells. 12 is the end of one thing and the beginning of another. They think they've been teaching you about submission, but they've actually been teaching you about transformation. When the oil touched her flesh that 12th time, Scarlett felt something snap inside her chest. Not breaking, but releasing, like a rope under tension suddenly cut free. The pain was still there, still terrible, still consuming. But now it felt like fuel rather than punishment, like energy being stored rather than spirit being destroyed. She understood now that every drop of oil they had poured on her had been building toward this moment, this completion, this graduation from victim to something else entirely. Master Whitfield and Crow saw none of this, of course. They saw only another successful session, another demonstration of absolute power over absolute helplessness. They saw Scarlett hanging limp in her restraints, her back a map of destruction, her silence complete and seemingly final. They thought they had achieved their masterpiece, had created the perfect example of submission through suffering. But the slaves who carried her back to the quarters afterward knew different. They could feel the change in her, could sense that whatever had been building during those 12 oil baths had finally reached completion. Scarlett was no longer the woman who had first been taken to that cursed building. She was something new, something that carried the accumulated pain of her people like a weapon waiting to be drawn. Aunt Minda looked into Scarlett's eyes as she worked her healing magic one last time, as she applied poultices and sang prayers that reached back to the beginning of time. What she saw there made her hands tremble, made her voice catch in her throat. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, more prayer than exclamation. They done created something they got no idea how to control. Now I'm gonna tell you about the conversations that happen between midnight and dawn, when the veil gets thin and the spirits of the departed come calling on the living. After that 12th oil bath, Scarlett found herself walking roads that existed only in the space between sleeping and waking, traveling to places where time moved different, and the dead had plenty to say to those still drawing breath. It was in that liminal hour, when the night was deepest and the morning still just a promise, that Kesey came to her daughter complete and whole, no longer the broken woman who had been torn away at Charleston's auction block, but the strong African mother who had carried stories and songs across the bitter water. She appeared in Scarlett's cabin like smoke given form, her skin carrying the rich darkness of a Khan earth, her eyes holding all the wisdom that slavery had tried to steal. "My daughter," Kesey said, her voice carrying harmonies that reached back to the motherland. "You have walked through fire 12 times, and 12 times you have emerged with your spirit intact. But now comes the hardest part, learning that survival ain't enough. The ancestors didn't preserve you through all that suffering just so you could endure. They preserved you so you could act." Scarlett sat up on her rough pallet, her scarred back aching, but her heart beating strong as African drums. Around them, the other slaves slept restless sleep, their dreams troubled by the day's labor and tomorrow's uncertainty. But here in this sacred space between worlds, mother and daughter could speak truths that daylight wouldn't allow. "Mama," Scarlett whispered, her voice thick with all the tears she had never been permitted to shed. "I hear you calling, but I don't understand what you want me to do. They got all the power, the whips, the chains, the law itself. What can one scarred woman do against all that?" Kesey smiled with the patience of eternity, reached out to touch her daughter's face with hands that felt solid as flesh, but carried the coolness of river water. "Child, you still thinking like somebody who believes in their power, but their power is built on lies. Lies about what we are, lies about what we can endure, lies about what we will accept. Every time they poured that oil on your back, they were teaching you the truth about their nature, showing you exactly how far they will go to maintain their illusion of superiority." Around them, the cabin began to fill with other presences. Grandmothers and great-grandmothers, aunties and sisters who had crossed over before their time. Children who had been sold away and never seen again. They gathered like smoke around a flame, their voices joining in harmony that spoke of justice delayed but never denied. "Tell her about the prophecy," whispered an ancient woman whose feet remembered the soil of Guinea, whose hands still carried the memory of gold dust and palm wine. Tell her what the cowrie shells revealed when you cast them before the ships came calling. Kesey nodded, her eyes growing distant with memory. Before you were born, daughter, when I was still in my father's house and the slave ships were just rumors from the coast, I went to see the Babalawo, the one who could read the future in shells and bones. I was pregnant with you then, carrying you high and proud, and I wanted to know what kind of world I was bringing you into. The conjure woman had cast her shells 3 times, and 3 times they had told the same story. A child would be born who would carry the pain of her people like a sacred burden, who would be tested by fire and emerge as something new, something that would balance the scales of justice in ways that defied understanding. The shells spoke of 12 trials, Kesey continued, 12 times of purification that would transform suffering into strength, victim into victor. But they also warned of a choice, added another voice, this one belonging to Scarlett's grandmother, a woman who had been a priestess in the old country before the raiders came. The choice between justice and vengeance, between setting things right and simply causing pain. The shells said you would have the power to do terrible things, but that the measure of your worth would be in how you chose to use that power. Scarlett felt the weight of generations pressing down on her, felt the hopes and dreams and deferred justice of countless ancestors gathering around her like a cloak. What if I'm not strong enough, she asked, her voice barely audible. What if I fail them? What if I fail you? Strong enough? Kesey laughed, a sound like water over stones, like wind through leaves, like children playing in village squares that existed now only in memory. Child, you have already proven your strength. You survived the middle passage in my womb. You survived the auction block and the separation. You survived 12 oil baths and came out with your humanity intact. The question ain't whether you're strong enough. The question is whether you're ready to accept the responsibility that comes with such strength. The spirits began to fade as dawn approached, their forms becoming translucent, their voices growing distant. But before they departed completely, they left Scarlett with visions, flashes of possible futures that danced behind her eyes like lightning illuminating storm clouds. She saw the oil house burning, saw Master Whitfield's face twisted with pain, saw herself standing tall and free while chains lay broken at her feet. But she also saw other possibilities, darker ones where justice became mere revenge, where breaking chains led only to forging new ones. Remember, Kesey's voice echoed as the last of the spirits departed. The ancestors don't want another master, even a black one. They want freedom, real freedom, the kind that can only come when people remember that every soul carries the divine spark, when suffering teaches compassion instead of cruelty. Use what they taught you, but don't become what they are. When morning came, Scarlett woke feeling different, feeling like someone who had been given both a terrible gift and an impossible responsibility. She understood now that her survival through the oil baths had been more than endurance. It had been preparation. The ancestors had been teaching her not just about pain, but about power. Not just about suffering, but about the precise application of justice. Old Aunt Minda watched her that morning with eyes that saw everything, saw the change that had occurred during the night hours, saw the weight of ancestral expectations settling on Scarlett's shoulders like a mantle. "They've been talking to you, ain't they?" the conjure woman said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had walked between worlds herself. "Yes," Scarlett replied simply, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of preparing for another day's labor. "And now I understand what they want me to do." "And what's that, child?" Scarlett looked up from her work, her eyes carrying depths that hadn't been there before, holding knowledge that came from sources older than slavery, older than America, older than the ships that had brought her people across the bitter water. "They want me to teach Master Whitfield the same lesson he's been teaching me. They want him to understand completely and finally what it feels like to have someone else decide how much pain you can endure." Aunt Minda nodded slowly, her weathered hands moving in patterns that called on protective spirits. "Then may the ancestors guide your steps, child, and may they grant you wisdom to know when justice is served." The oil house sat quiet as a tomb that November morning, its usual fires banked low, its cauldrons empty and cold for the first time in months. Master Whitfield had given Crow permission to take a few days to visit his sister's family down near Savannah, a reward for months of dedicated service in maintaining proper discipline among the plantation's human property. The overseer had departed that Monday morning with his saddlebags packed and his pale eyes bright with anticipation of pleasures that awaited him in the city. What Master Whitfield hadn't expected was how much he would miss the rhythm of the oil house sessions, how the absence of that particular outlet would affect his temperament and daily routine. He found himself walking past the silent building several times each day, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind turning over plans for new refinements to the disciplinary process when Crow returned. The forced hiatus had given him time to think, to plan, to consider improvements that would make their theological instruction even more effective. Mrs. Whitfield noticed the change in her husband immediately, saw how he paced the big house like a caged animal, how he snapped at the house slaves for minor infractions that he normally would have ignored. "Jonathan," she said one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the cotton fields, "you seem agitated lately. Perhaps you should take up reading again, or correspondence with your colleagues in Charleston. This preoccupation with plantation discipline is becoming unseemly." But Master Whitfield barely heard his wife's concerns, his mind occupied with more pressing matters. He had been reading extensively in the theological literature concerning the proper correction of the African character, had been corresponding with other plantation owners who shared his commitment to scientific approaches to slave management. There was a growing consensus among enlightened masters that traditional methods, simple whipping, confinement, reduction of rations, were insufficient for dealing with the more stubborn specimens of Negro resistance. The oil house represented a breakthrough in applied theology, a marriage of Christian instruction with practical psychology that produced results far superior to crude physical punishment. But Master Whitfield had begun to suspect that even these advanced methods required consistency, required regular application to maintain their effectiveness. Allowing too much time to pass between sessions might diminish their instructional value, might allow the subject to forget the lessons that had been so carefully imparted. It was Thursday afternoon when he decided that Scarlett was due for a refresher course, a gentle reminder of the principles that governed her existence on his plantation. He had been watching her work in the cotton fields, had noticed what seemed to him a subtle change in her posture, a slight straightening of her back that suggested her spirit might be recovering from the thorough correction it had received. Such regression could not be allowed to continue unchecked. "Scarlett," he called as the field hands prepared to return to the quarters for their evening meal. "Come here, please. I want to speak with you." She approached with the measured pace of someone who had learned to read danger in the set of white shoulders, in the tone of white voices, in the particular quality of silence that preceded trouble. But there was something different about her movement now, something that Master Whitfield registered without fully understanding, a steadiness that hadn't been there before, a centeredness that spoke of resources he hadn't known she possessed. "Sir?" she said, her eyes fixed on the ground in the manner that proper slaves had learned to maintain when addressing their betters. But even in that submissive posture, there was something that didn't quite fit, something that suggested the downcast eyes were choice rather than compulsion. Master Whitfield studied her for a long moment, trying to identify what exactly had changed about her appearance, her bearing, her presence. The scars from the oil baths were healing well, no longer the angry red welts they had been, but settling into the pale ridges that would mark her flesh permanently. Her body showed the proper deference, her voice carried the appropriate tone of respect. And yet, "I've been thinking about your education, Scarlett," he said finally, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a professor addressing a particularly challenging student. "About the lessons we've been working through together, about your progress in understanding your proper place in God's ordained hierarchy. I'm concerned that the recent hiatus in your instruction may have allowed certain undesirable attitudes to resurface." Scarlett said nothing, but Master Whitfield thought he detected the faintest flicker of something in her posture. Not defiance exactly, but something that suggested she was listening with more attention than a properly broken slave should bring to her master's words. "The oil house has been silent too long," he continued. warming to his theme as he always did when discussing the theoretical foundations of proper slave management. Discipline, like faith, requires regular exercise to maintain its effectiveness. The African mind, being naturally inclined toward regression to primitive patterns of thought, must be consistently reminded of civilized expectations. He paused, expecting some response. Fear, perhaps, or pleading, or the kind of desperate compliance that he had learned to recognize as the mark of successful correction. But Scarlett's silence was complete, unreadable, carrying depths that made him slightly uncomfortable, though he couldn't articulate why. "Tomorrow morning," Master Whitfield said, his decision crystallizing as he spoke, "we'll resume your theological education. I think a session in the oil house will help clarify any confusion that may have developed during this unfortunate interruption in your instruction." He smiled the smile that had preceded every previous session, the expression of a man confident in his power and pleased with his own benevolence. It was then that Scarlett looked up, just for a moment, just long enough for Master Whitfield to see her eyes directly. What he saw there should have warned him, should have sent him running back to the big house to reconsider his plans. But Master Whitfield had grown so accustomed to absolute power, so confident in his ability to break any resistance, that he interpreted what he saw as a challenge to be met rather than a danger to be avoided. "Yes, sir," Scarlett said, her voice carrying the same flat tone she had used throughout all their previous encounters. But underneath that compliance, Master Whitfield thought he heard something else. Not fear, not submission, but something that sounded almost like anticipation. That night, Scarlett sat by the small fire in her cabin and prepared herself with the thoroughness of a warrior preparing for battle. She gathered roots that Aunt Minda had taught her to use, herbs that would sharpen her vision and steady her hands. She sang songs that reached back to the motherland, prayers that called on ancestors whose names had been lost, but whose power remained. She touched the scars on her back, each one a reminder of lessons learned, each one a promise made and kept. The ancestors gathered around her as she worked, their presence so thick in the air that even the other slaves could feel it, could sense that something momentous was approaching, like a storm building on the horizon. Old Moses looked up from mending his shoes and shivered, though the night was warm. Young Celia woke from sleep with tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't remember her dreams. "Tomorrow," Scarlett whispered to the spirits that surrounded her, "we settle accounts. Tomorrow, justice comes calling at the oil house, and Master Whitfield learns what it feels like to be on the receiving end of his own theology." In the big house, Master Whitfield slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who had never doubted his place in the world, who had never imagined that the natural order of things could be challenged by someone he considered property. He dreamed of oil and fire and the satisfaction of absolute control, never suspecting that his own confidence would be the weapon used to destroy him. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharpness in the air that seemed to cut right through a person's clothes and settle in their bones. Master Whitfield woke with the satisfaction of a man who had a pleasant day's work ahead of him, who had planned an activity that would provide both spiritual instruction and personal satisfaction. He dressed with extra care, selecting his finest coat and his most comfortable boots, preparing for what he anticipated would be a lengthy and rewarding session in the oil house. The fires had been lit before dawn by the field hands assigned to maintain the equipment, the great iron cauldrons heating steadily while the plantation came slowly to life around them. Steam began to rise from the smaller vessels as the oil reached the precise temperature that experience had taught was most effective for instructional purposes, hot enough to cause immediate and lasting damage, but not so hot as to kill outright, and thus end the lesson prematurely. Master Whitfield took his time over breakfast, savoring his coffee and fresh biscuits, while Mrs. Whitfield complained about the cold draft that seemed to be coming from somewhere in the house. The servants moved around them with the practiced invisibility of people who had learned to disappear while still performing their duties, but even they seemed more nervous than usual, their movements carrying an undercurrent of tension that suggested something was different about this particular morning. "You seem particularly pleased with yourself today, Jonathan," Mrs. Whitfield observed as her husband lingered over his second cup of coffee. "Has something pleasant happened that I should know about?" "Just attending to some necessary business," Master Whitfield replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who took pride in his work. Ensuring that proper order is maintained, that Christian principles are properly understood by those who need such instruction. He didn't elaborate, knowing that his wife preferred not to hear details about the practical aspects of plantation management, especially those that involved what she delicately referred to as disciplinary measures. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Master Whitfield finally made his way to the oil house, walking with the measured pace of a man who was in no hurry because he was completely certain of his control over the situation. He had sent word to the quarters for Scarlett to be brought to meet him there, and he expected to find her waiting in the proper attitude of submission and fear that had characterized all their previous encounters. But when he entered the oil house, what he found was not what he expected. Scarlett was there, yes, standing beside the largest of the cauldrons where the oil bubbled and steamed in readiness. But her posture was different, not the hunched, defensive crouch of someone anticipating pain, but the straight-backed stance of someone who had made peace with whatever was coming. Her hands were not trembling with fear as they had in previous sessions, but steady and still at her sides. "Good morning, Scarlett," Master Whitfield said, his voice carrying the false warmth that he had perfected for these occasions. "I trust you've had time to consider your recent behavior, to reflect on the lessons we've been working through together." He moved toward the cauldron, expecting her to retreat as she had always done before, to cower away from the instrument of her correction. Instead, Scarlett turned to face him directly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since that day in the hallway, when the broken pitcher had started this entire sequence of instruction. What Master Whitfield saw in those eyes should have stopped him in his tracks, should have sent him backing toward the door and calling for help. But he had grown so accustomed to absolute power, so confident in his ability to break any resistance, that he interpreted her direct gaze as merely the final flicker of defiance before complete submission. "I've had considerable time to reflect, Master Whitfield," Scarlett said, her voice carrying tones that he had never heard before, not the careful deference of a slave addressing her master, but something that sounded almost like equality, almost like conversation between equals. "And I believe I've learned everything you intended to teach me." Master Whitfield frowned, uncertain how to interpret her words or her tone. This was not following the script that had been established in their previous sessions, not proceeding according to the pattern of resistance, correction, and eventual submission that he had come to expect. "I'm pleased to hear that," he said cautiously, moving closer to the cauldron while keeping his eyes fixed on her face. "Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding?" It was then that Scarlett smiled, and that smile contained multitudes, all the pain of the Middle Passage, all the anguish of separated families, all the accumulated suffering of her people across generations of bondage. But it also contained something else, something that made Master Whitfield's blood run suddenly cold despite the heat of the oil house. "I'd be happy to demonstrate my understanding," she said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had finally found her purpose. "You see, you've taught me very thoroughly about the application of heated oil to human flesh. You've shown me exactly how much pain one person can inflict on another, exactly how to use suffering as an educational tool. And now I think it's time for you to experience your own curriculum from the student's perspective." The realization of what she was suggesting hit Master Whitfield like a physical blow, but by then it was already too late. Scarlett's hands, steadied by the spirits of her ancestors and guided by 12 lessons in precisely this kind of work, were already reaching for the iron ladle that lay beside the cauldron. Her movements were swift and sure, perfected through observation and refined by necessity. "Wait," Master Whitfield said, his voice suddenly high and strained, carrying the panic of a man who had never before found himself on the receiving end of his own methods. "Scarlett, think about what you're doing. Think about the consequences. You can't possibly—" But Scarlett was no longer listening to his words, her attention focused entirely on the task at hand, on the completion of an education that had taken 12 sessions to complete. "The consequences?" she said, her voice carrying the rhythm of prayer, the cadence of justice long delayed, "are something I've been thinking about for quite some time. The oil, when it left the ladle, carried with it all the accumulated weight of her people's suffering, all the deferred justice of generations who had died in bondage, and Master Whitfield, in that moment of ultimate education, finally understood exactly what he had been teaching all along. Not submission, not proper order, not Christian instruction, but the simple truth that every action carries within it the seeds of its own reversal, that every teacher eventually becomes a student, that every master must someday reckon with the lessons they have taught. What happened next in that oil house ain't something I tell lightly, ain't something I speak of without calling on the ancestors to guide my words and protect my spirit. But some truths got to be told, even when they burn the tongue that speaks them, even when they challenge every notion folks got about right and wrong, about justice and vengeance, about what happens when the oppressed finally find themselves holding the tools of oppression. The oil left that iron ladle like liquid judgment, like fire made manifest, like every prayer for justice that had ever risen from the slave quarters finally given physical form. It struck Master Whitfield's face with the sound of meat hitting a hot skillet, and the scream that tore from his throat was like nothing that had ever echoed in that building before. Not the controlled, instructional pain he had so carefully administered to others, but raw, primal agony that spoke of a soul suddenly confronted with its own mortality. Master Whitfield's hands flew to his face, trying to wipe away the burning oil, but succeeding only in spreading it further across his features, down his neck, into the fine fabric of his expensive coat. The smell that filled the air was different from what had filled it during Scarlett's sessions. Not just burning flesh, but burning privilege, burning certainty, burning assumptions about who had the right to cause pain and who was destined to receive it. "Sweet Jesus!" Master Whitfield shrieked, stumbling backward, his feet tangling in themselves as he tried to escape the consequences of his own education. "Help me! Somebody help me!" But the oil house was isolated from the rest of the plantation, deliberately positioned where screams wouldn't disturb the delicate sensibilities of those in the big house, where lessons could be administered without troubling the sleep of those who preferred not to know the details of their wealth's foundation. Scarlett watched his panic with the detached interest of someone observing an experiment, studying the way Master Whitfield's composure disintegrated under the application of his own methodology. She dipped the ladle again, her movements steady and deliberate, informed by 12 sessions of careful observation, refined by detailed attention to the techniques that had been so thoroughly demonstrated for her education. "Please," Master Whitfield gasped, his voice already changing as the oil worked its way into his throat, as his vocal cords began to swell and distort. "Please, Scarlett, I can make you free. I can give you papers, money, anything you want. Just stop this madness." His eyes, those pale eyes that had watched her suffering with such satisfaction, were wide with terror and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite comprehend that the natural order of his world had been so completely reversed. But Scarlett had moved beyond the reach of his offers, beyond the power of his promises, into a space where only justice could speak. "You want to know what I want?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of generations, the accumulated hopes and dreams of all who had suffered under his authority. "I want you to understand what you've been teaching. I want you to experience your own curriculum completely, thoroughly, without any of the theological justification you used to make yourself feel righteous while causing pain." The second ladleful caught Master Whitfield on his hands and arms as he tried to shield himself, the oil eating through his fine cotton sleeves, through the pale skin that had never known labor, into flesh that had never experienced anything worse than a paper cut or a shaving nick. He fell to his knees, his screams echoing off the oil house walls, bouncing back at him from every surface like voices of judgment. "This is what you did to me 12 times, Scarlett said, her voice never rising above conversational tone, never showing the rage that Master Whitfield would have expected from someone in her position. 12 times you brought me here and poured burning oil on my flesh while you quoted scripture about obedience and submission. 12 times you taught me that pain was simply another tool for maintaining proper order." Master Whitfield tried to crawl toward the door, his movements clumsy and desperate, leaving a trail of blood and oil on the rough wooden floor. But Scarlett moved with him, her steps measured and sure, the ladle in her hand catching the light from the fires that still burned beneath the cauldrons, still heated the oil that would complete his education. "And now," she continued, dipping the ladle a third time, watching the oil bubble and steam as she lifted it from the cauldron, "I'm going to apply those same educational principles to you. I'm going to teach you what it feels like to be completely powerless, to have someone else decide how much suffering your body can endure, to pray for mercy from someone who sees pain as merely another method of instruction. The third portion of oil found its mark on Master Whitfield's back as he tried to crawl away, the liquid fire eating through his clothes and into his spine, teaching his nervous system lessons he had never imagined possible. His screams had changed now, become something less than human, something that spoke of spirit breaking along with flesh, of assumptions crumbling along with skin. "You see?" Scarlett said, moving around him with the careful attention of a craftsman perfecting her work. "The difference between us is that I learned my lessons well. I learned about endurance, about finding strength in suffering, about maintaining dignity even when everything else was stripped away. But you never learned any of those things because you never had to. You never had to find out what you were really made of, because you never faced anything harder than deciding how much pain to inflict on others." Master Whitfield's attempts at speech had become unintelligible now, his voice destroyed by the oil, his words lost in a gurgling that might have been pleading or might have been prayer. Scarlett knelt beside him, bringing her face close to his ruined features, speaking directly into his remaining ear. "I want you to know," she said, her voice carrying the gentleness of someone imparting a final lesson, "that this ain't about hatred. This ain't about revenge, even though it might look like that to someone watching. This is about balance, about making sure that accounts are settled, about ensuring that the lessons you taught actually reach their intended conclusion." She stood again, walked back to the cauldron, lifted the entire small pot with both hands. The ancestors were with her now, their voices rising in harmony that seemed to make the very air shimmer with power. Their presence so thick in the oil house that even a dying man could feel them gathering, could sense that something larger than human justice was at work. "Your Bible talks about reaping what you sow," Scarlett said, holding the cauldron above Master Whitfield's writhing form. "About every action having its consequences, about accounts being settled in the fullness of time. Well, sir, time's up. The lesson is complete. And now you get to understand completely and finally what it means to be on the receiving end of your own theology." The remaining oil fell like judgment itself, like liquid retribution, like every prayer for justice that had ever been whispered in slave quarters finally given physical form. Master Whitfield's screams stopped not because the pain had ended, but because his capacity for expressing pain had been exceeded, because his body had reached the point where suffering became something beyond sound, beyond movement, beyond anything recognizably human. Scarlett set the empty cauldron aside and looked down at what remained of the man who had orchestrated 12 sessions of carefully applied torture, who had quoted scripture while overseeing the systematic destruction of human dignity. What she saw was not a master or a teacher or a keeper of divine order, but simply a man who had learned too late that every teacher eventually becomes a student, that every action carries within it the seeds of its own reversal. The ancestors began to fade as their work approached completion, their voices diminishing to whispers, their forms becoming transparent against the smoky air of the oil house. But before they departed entirely, Scarlett heard her mama's voice one final time, clear and proud and full of love that transcended the boundaries between life and death. "Well done, daughter," Casey whispered, her words carrying the approval of generations. "The debt is paid, the balance is restored. Now comes the hardest part, learning to live with what justice sometimes requires, learning to carry the weight of necessary actions without letting them poison your soul." The silence that followed Master Whitfield's final breath was unlike anything the oil house had ever contained. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so complete, so final, that it seemed to absorb all other noise into itself. Even the crackling of the fires beneath the cauldron seemed muted, respectful, as if the elements themselves recognized that something momentous had just occurred, something that would change the fundamental nature of that place forever. Scarlett stood over Master Whitfield's still form for a long moment, her eyes taking in the scene with the detached assessment of someone reviewing completed work. The man who had entered the oil house that morning full of confidence and anticipation lay transformed into something unrecognizable, his body bearing the same marks of destruction he had so methodically applied to others, his flesh carrying the same lessons in pain and powerlessness that he had considered so essential to African education. But it wasn't satisfaction that filled Scarlett's chest as she looked down at her former master. It was something more complex, something that carried equal measures of completion and emptiness, of justice served and innocence lost. The ancestors had been right when they warned her about the weight that necessary actions sometimes carried, about the price of being the instrument through which long-delayed justice finally found expression. Outside the oil house, the plantation continued its daily rhythms, unaware that the fundamental order of their world had just shifted on its axis. Field hands worked the late cotton harvest, house slaves prepared the midday meal, overseers supervised labor with whips and curses, all of them operating under assumptions about power and submission that had just been proven tragically false. None of them knew yet that the man who owned them all, who held absolute authority over their lives and deaths, lay dead in his own torture chamber, killed by one of the very people he had considered property. Scarlett moved through the oil house with purposeful efficiency, her actions guided by intelligence that had been sharpened by survival and refined by careful observation. She cleaned the ladle and replaced it beside the cauldron, banked the fires to prevent the building from catching flame, arranged the scene to tell a story that would protect the other slaves from collective punishment. When investigators eventually came, they would find evidence of an accident. Master Whitfield had been inspecting the equipment alone when something went wrong, when his own carelessness with heated oil had resulted in his demise. The walk from the oil house to the quarters seemed to take forever and no time at all, each step carrying Scarlett further from her old life and closer to something entirely new. She could feel the eyes of the other slaves on her as she passed, could sense their awareness that something fundamental had changed even though they didn't yet understand what. There was something different about her posture, something in her face that spoke of completion, of a task finished and a debt finally paid. Old Moses was the first to understand. He took one look at Scarlett as she approached her cabin and saw immediately what had occurred, saw in her eyes the particular kind of stillness that comes after violent action, after crossing lines that can never be uncrossed. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, his voice carrying prayer and awe and terror in equal measure. "What have you done, child?" "What needed doing?" Scarlett replied simply, her voice carrying the calm that comes after storms, after the release of pressure that has been building for too long. "What the ancestors called me to do. What 12 oil baths prepared me for." She looked around at the gathering slaves, seeing in their faces the mixture of fear and hope that always accompanied news of resistance, the awareness that any challenge to white authority would bring consequences that would fall on all their heads. Aunt Minda emerged from her cabin like smoke made solid, her ancient eyes immediately taking in the situation, with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades reading signs and interpreting portents. She approached Scarlett with the careful steps of someone approaching a person who had been fundamentally changed, who carried within herself forces that demanded respect and caution. "How long before they find him?" the conjure woman asked, her voice pitched low to avoid carrying beyond their small circle. "Not long," Scarlett replied. "Mrs. Whitfield will send someone looking when he doesn't come to dinner. Crow's due back from Savannah tomorrow." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her people, seeing in them the mixture of admiration and terror that her actions had inspired. "But I arranged it to look like accident. Spilled oil, slippery floor, man who got careless around equipment he didn't fully understand." The slaves exchanged glances, their minds already working through the implications, the changes that Master Whitfield's death would bring to their daily existence. His widow would need to manage the plantation until arrangements could be made for its sale or transfer. Crow would likely assume greater authority in the interim, and there would be investigations, questions, scrutiny that could expose any one of them to suspicion and punishment. But underneath their practical concerns ran a deeper current, a recognition that something had shifted in the fundamental balance of their world. One of their own had struck back at the system that oppressed them all, had proved that resistance was possible even under the most extreme circumstances, had demonstrated that the masters were not invulnerable, that their power was not absolute or unchangeable. Young Celia, the girl whose broken pitcher had started this entire chain of events, approached Scarlett with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of gratitude that extended far beyond her individual situation. Thank you for taking the blame for me, for enduring what you endured so I wouldn't have to." Scarlett reached out and touched the girl's face with hands that still carried the heat of the oil house, still trembled slightly from the enormity of what they had accomplished. "Don't thank me yet," she said gently. "What I did today will echo through this plantation for years to come. There will be consequences, investigations, changes that we can't predict. The man is dead, but the system that created him is still alive, still hungry, still looking for ways to maintain control." As if summoned by her words, a commotion arose from the direction of the big house. Shouts and running footsteps, the sound of Mrs. Whitfield's voice raised in alarm and confusion. Someone had discovered Master Whitfield's absence, had gone looking for him, had found what remained in the oil house. The investigation that would determine Scarlett's fate, and potentially the fate of every slave on the plantation, was beginning. "Remember?" Scarlett said quickly, her voice carrying the urgency of final instructions. "You know nothing about what happened in the oil house today. Master Whitfield went there alone to inspect equipment, to ensure that everything was ready for Crow's return tomorrow. What happened after that was accident, tragedy, the kind of misfortune that sometimes befalls men who work too closely with dangerous tools." The slaves nodded their understanding, their faces already arranging themselves into expressions of appropriate shock and grief, preparing for the performances that would protect them all from the consequences of justice finally served. But in their eyes, Scarlett could see something that hadn't been there before: hope. Not the hope of immediate freedom or dramatic change, but the hope that came from seeing proof that resistance was possible, that the masters were mortal, that the system that seemed so permanent and unshakable could be challenged by those it sought to control. As the investigation began in earnest, as white men from neighboring plantations and officials from town came to examine the scene and question the slaves, that hope would spread like wildfire through the quarters, carrying with it the whispered story of Scarlett, who had endured 12 oil baths and emerged not broken but transformed, who had taken the master's own methods and used them to restore the balance of justice. The second in which Master Whitfield's screams had finally stopped echoing in the oil house marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. A world where slaves could imagine themselves as agents of their own destiny, where suffering could be transformed into strength, where the tools of oppression could become instruments of liberation. That second would resonate through every slave cabin on every plantation where the story eventually traveled, would plant seeds of resistance that would grow in darkness until they were strong enough to break through the earth and reach toward the light of freedom. Years have passed since that November morning when justice came calling at the oil house. Years that have carried away most of the folks who witnessed what happened. Years that have seen slavery itself crumble under the weight of its own contradictions and the resistance of those who refused to accept their chains. But the story of Scarlett, Scarlett of the oil bath, Scarlett who took the master's medicine and fed it back to him, that story lives on, passed from mouth to mouth like sacred flame, like medicine for wounded spirits, like proof that suffering ain't always the end of the tale. They never did figure out what really happened in that oil house, though plenty of white men came asking questions, poking around the slave quarters with suspicious eyes and threatening voices. The official conclusion was accidental death. Master Whitfield had been inspecting equipment alone when he slipped on spilled oil and fell into his own cauldron, a tragic irony that local newspapers would describe as the sort of divine justice that sometimes befalls men who work too closely with dangerous tools. Mrs. Whitfield sold the plantation within 6 months and moved back to Charleston, taking only her personal household slaves and leaving the field hands to be sold at auction to pay her husband's debts. Crow tried to maintain control when he returned from Savannah, tried to use violence and intimidation to restore the order that had somehow shifted during his brief absence. But something had changed in the slaves' response to his authority, something he couldn't quite identify or counter. They still obeyed his orders, still worked the fields and performed their assigned tasks, but there was a quality to their compliance that felt different, not the broken submission he was accustomed to, but something that carried undertones of choice, of temporary cooperation rather than permanent surrender. The overseer lasted 3 more months before he was found dead in his cabin one morning, officially the victim of a heart attack brought on by excessive drinking and the stress of managing an increasingly unruly workforce. But the slaves knew better. understood that justice had many faces and many methods, that Scarlett's actions had opened doors that could never be completely closed again. Scarlett herself disappeared from the plantation 2 weeks after the auction that sold most of her companions to new masters scattered across Georgia and South Carolina. Some say she was purchased by a kindly master who recognized her value and treated her well for the rest of her days. Others claim she escaped north on the Underground Railroad, following the drinking gourd to freedom in Canada or New York. But the oldest voices, the ones that remember closest to truth, whisper different stories. Stories of a woman who simply walked away one morning and was never seen again, who disappeared into the swamps and forests like smoke returning to fire, like spirit returning to source. What I know for certain is that Scarlett became something larger than any individual person could be, became a symbol that carried power beyond the boundaries of her own life and death. Her story spread through the slave networks that connected plantation to plantation, carried by field hands and house servants, by drivers and dock workers, by all the invisible people who formed the true communication system of the South. Each telling added new details, new interpretations, new lessons for those who heard and remembered. In some versions, Scarlett was a conjure woman who called on African spirits to give her strength for her revenge. In others, she was a Christian martyr who sacrificed herself to save her people from oppression. Sometimes she was described as 7 feet tall with hands like iron, sometimes as small and delicate but possessed of supernatural power. The details changed with each telling, but the essential truth remained constant: that one of their own had stood up to absolute power and emerged victorious, that suffering could be transformed into strength, that the tools of oppression could become instruments of liberation. Young slaves who heard Scarlett's story began to carry themselves differently, began to understand that endurance was not the same as acceptance, that survival could be a form of resistance, that maintaining dignity and humanity in the face of dehumanization was itself a kind of victory. House servants whispered her name when they were forced to smile while being humiliated. Field hands invoked her memory when whips cracked overhead. Mothers told their children about the woman who proved that no power on earth was absolute or unchangeable. The story traveled north too, carried by escaped slaves who found refuge in free cities and abolitionist communities. Frederick Douglass himself mentioned hearing about a Georgia woman who turned her master's cruelty back upon him, in speeches given to sympathetic audiences in Boston and Philadelphia. Harriet Tubman, that Moses of her people, was said to carry Scarlett's story with her on rescue missions south, telling it to frightened refugees as proof that God's justice, though sometimes delayed, was never denied. But it was in the slave quarters that Scarlett's story carried its deepest meaning, where her example provided hope during the darkest hours of bondage. When children were sold away from their parents, when women were forced to submit to masters' appetites, when men were worked to death in rice fields and cotton plantations, the story of Scarlett reminded them that their oppressors were mortal, that systems built on cruelty contained the seeds of their own destruction, that justice delayed was not justice denied. The Civil War came eventually, as wars sometimes do when systems of oppression become too heavy for any society to bear indefinitely. Union armies marched through Georgia, liberating plantations and breaking chains, bringing freedom to millions who had dreamed of it but never dared expect it. When the soldiers came, they found among the freed slaves stories of resistance and rebellion that had never appeared in any official records, tales of individual defiance and collective action that challenged everything the wider world thought it knew about slavery and submission. Scarlett's story survived the war and Reconstruction, survived Jim Crow and segregation, survived all the attempts to reduce the complexity of the slave experience to simple narratives of victimization and eventual liberation. Her tale lived on in barbershops and beauty salons, in churches and community centers, wherever people gathered who remembered that freedom was something that had to be fought for in every generation, that justice required active participants rather than passive recipients. Today, when young people ask about their ancestors' response to oppression, when they want to know whether their people ever fought back or always submitted meekly to injustice, the old voices still tell Scarlett's story. They speak of the woman who endured 12 oil baths and emerged not broken but transformed, who proved that suffering could teach strength as well as submission, who demonstrated that every action carries within it the seeds of its own reversal. Her name has become a prayer, a promise, a reminder that no system of oppression has ever been permanent, that every empire built on cruelty has eventually fallen, that justice may be delayed, but never completely denied. When people speak of ancestors who paved the way for freedom, who sacrificed themselves so future generations might live with dignity, they remember Scarlett, who paid the full price for her resistance and counted it worthwhile. The memory we keep alive here ain't just about one woman's revenge on one cruel master. It's about the principle that suffering without resistance leads only to more suffering, that dignity maintained in the face of dehumanization is itself a form of victory, that every individual act of courage contributes to the larger struggle for liberation that spans generations. So when you hear Scarlett's story, don't just think about the oil that burned or the master who died or the justice that was finally served. Think about the hope that survived, the dignity that endured, the spirit that refused to be broken no matter what was done to break it. Think about the ancestors who carried that story forward so you could hear it today, so you could understand that freedom ain't something that's given. It's something that's taken, something that's earned through sacrifice and struggle and the willingness to pay whatever price justice demands. Those who suffered, suffered. Those who resisted left a legacy. And that legacy is kept here, with us. Scars of captivity.